Welcome and thanks for joining us, everyone. We will be starting shortly. Again, thank you so much for everyone who is here. I just wanted to make a few announcements before I hand it over to our speakers. First, I want to let you know that we are recording this session and it will be available in Whova, our conference app, within about 2 weeks after the Congress ends. If you'd like to ask our speakers a question during this session, please use the Q&A area to the right of your screen. The chat window is where you can engage with other attendees as well. And we kindly ask that you keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentation and follow the presenter's lead on when to engage with cameras and microphones on. It looks like we are about to get started. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Molly to get us going with our speakers.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone for joining this morning. So this part, we're continuing our special session on the nexus of climate change and fire. And in this section, we're really focusing on localized case studies of what managers are really faced with in particular localities with regard to changing fire regimes and some approaches that they're using to address the challenge. Starting out, we're going to be hearing from John Kupfer from University of South Carolina regarding prescribed fire in the Southeast. So I'll kick it over to you, John.
All right, thank you, Molly. I want to first of all express my appreciation to those of you who've organized it and for all of you guys who've come and are participating in this session as we near the end of what's been a really interesting conference so far. So to begin, the research group that's been involved in this work received funding in 2015 from the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center for a project that was focused on conservation planning in the Southeast. And specifically our project, which was known as the Vital Futures Project, was meant to focus on the design and implementation of adaptive strategies that account for near and longer term threats to regional biodiversity by looking at the implications of climate change and other drivers of landscape change and how those relate to existing and future conservation goals and management objectives. Now, in keeping with the theme of these overall sessions, this work is also linked to the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or SECAS. If you're not familiar with it, SECAS was created by a collaborative network of regional conservation partners, and it was meant to engage federal, state, nonprofit, and private entities to coordinate conservation actions and investments that will improve the health, function, and connectivity of ecosystems in the Southeast. And the time horizon for that was sort of looking 50 to 100 years out. One component of that work that some of you guys, especially if you're based in the Southeast, might be familiar with is the Southeast Conservation Blueprint that Rua Mordecai and other folks have been working on in recent years. Now, today what I want to talk about are the linkages between climate, fire, and landscape change. We've all, I think, seen headlines and articles like those that you can see on this slide in different media outlets over the last few years talking about the potential interactions between human activities and wildfire regimes. And we've seen this for areas around the world, whether those have played out in Australia, the Amazon, the Western United States, or even in my home region here in the Southeastern US. Now, if we think in terms of climate change, projections here are for warming conditions over the remainder of the 21st century. Models in turn suggest an increased fire risk and a longer fire season, with at least a 30% increase in the area burned by lightning ignited wildfire from 2011 through about 50 years out by 2060. We've done some other work if you're interested in it. I don't have time to talk about it today, but recently published in Science of the Total Environment, looking at changing fire regimes in the United States based on some of the projected climate impacts that we're expecting to see over the remainder of the 21st century. Now, those types of changes would greatly impact ecological conditions, obviously, in these areas, and it would affect a host of ecosystem services. However, despite all of the attention that wildfires receive in the media, the area burned in the Southeast by prescribed fires each year greatly exceeds that's burned by wildfires. Regionally, managers conduct prescribed burns that cover about 3 million hectares annually, some years more. Those fires are set, of course, to achieve a full range of ecological, economic, and societal objectives. And it's also, of course, an important tool in reducing wildfire risk. So as you look at this graphic, for instance, you can see how the reintroduction or increasing use of prescribed fire at Fort Benning, Georgia, just shown by the orange bars, has led to a decrease in wildfire occurrence over about 3 decades. It's now clear that if you look at areas like ours, fire on these landscapes has become a purposeful and managed process in many areas, and it's one that's crucial for the health of several key ecosystems and species. All right, so what I want to do then is over the remaining 10 minutes or so is talk briefly about 2 of our ongoing projects that are focused on fire, because fire, of course, remains one of the most important ecological processes in the Southeast, and effective fire management in the context of climate change will likely be one of the greatest land management challenges that we're going to see regionally over the remainder of the century. For both of these topics, I'll limit myself to around 4 to 5 minutes each, and I'll give you just sort of a snapshot of what we've been doing, some of the goals and some basic findings. And then you can feel free to follow up with me either during questions if we have time or offline, and I'll get back to you and I can talk with you about the work that we've been doing otherwise. All right, so the first study is focused on burn window definition. This was published, by the way, last year in IJWF, so I can forward that if you're interested. And it was focused on projecting the potential effects of climate change and opportunities for prescribed burning. Now, we did this by analyzing future changes in the percentage of days that meet some basic prescribed burn criteria, otherwise known as the burn windows. And we did that using weather input from a suite of global climate models under 2 different emission scenarios through the late 21st century. Now, we started by identifying those thresholds, which again are conditions under which fires would be permitted and conducted. And we came up with 3 basic meteorological criteria, and these were in part predicated on needing to have future predictions of these values. So they had to be things that we could have data, not just currently or recently for, but as we look ahead up and through the end of the century. Those 3 variables were mean time temperature, mean time relative humidity, and mean annual winds or mean daily wind speed, excuse me. The specific window values came from the literature, came from burning guidelines that are used by regional fire managers, came from interviews, and it came from the experience of some of the PIs that were involved in the project itself. Once we came up with those values, which you can see here on the screen, we validated them against more than 240,000 different burn permits that were collected from Florida and Georgia from 2006 to 2016, so basically an 11-year period. And what we found is that nearly all of the days in which permits were requested fell within those thresholds. And especially the one that you can see here is the thresholding for noontime temperature, is that nearly all of the fires and almost all of the burned area, permitted burned area fell within these specific thresholds. So we have a little bit lengthier validation of that, but that's just to give you a sense that we did go through this, and these thresholds were indeed capturing what was happening over a huge number of fires in at least 2 of the states that are part of our study area. All right, what we then used were future projections of those variables that were derived from 18 different GCMs under 2 future greenhouse gas emission scenarios. So if you're familiar with representative concentration pathways or RCPs, these are different scenarios for changes in atmospheric greenhouse gas composition and how that would be likely to influence some of the things like temperature and the other variables that we're looking at. We then calculated and mapped changes in the number of days that meet these burn window conditions using this data from the multivariate adaptive constructed analogs or MACA future climate data sets. All right, so as you look at this figure, and I'll give you just 2 of these, but there's a lot more in the paper that you can sort of dig into if you're interested. What you see are the multi-model mean percentage of suitable burn days, and they're mapped for 3 different seasons: for winter, for summer, and then for sort of a spring transitional season. And if you look across the rows, these are 3 different time periods. This would be historical simulations, end of century RCP 4.5, and end of century 8.5, which would correspond in 4.5 to sort of a modest change in conditions. 8.5 is a greater range of impacts as we look towards the end of the century. And the most prominent thing as you look down these columns is when you look at winter. The darkest green, again, is showing very little change, or showing lots of days that fall within the burn window, excuse me. We really don't see much change as we look to the end of the century, regardless of which future climate scenario it is that we're considering. If you look at summer, however, in many of these areas, what we had were places where at least 40 or 50 or 60% of the days were suitable for burning. By time, especially for the RCP 8.5 scenarios, by the time you look at the end of the century, you're seeing conditions where there are very, very few days that are going to be available for burning, especially as you go more towards the southern, so warmer, or especially as you go maybe towards some of the drier conditions as you head off towards Texas. So in other words, throughout much of the Southeast, what we're seeing during summer is that a lot of that summer burning season is disappearing, and burners might need to come up with some more flexible ways if they are intent on carrying out fires during that time of year. Here's a different way of looking at this. So these are just 6 different management units that we chose to focus on: Land Between the Lakes, Ouachita National Forest, Kisatchie, Big Cypress National Park and Preserve, National Preserve, excuse me, Chattahoochee and Uwharrie. And what you see here is, if you look at the black lines, these are showing again the percentage of suitable burn days that you have, both in sort of a historic period, which are the darker gray areas to the left, and then under predicted climate changes as we go forward in time. And for all of these, what you're seeing again are just changes that are taking place and huge reductions in the number and percentage of days that will be suitable for fire managers to conduct prescribed burns. All right, so that was just sort of a few things that we found from the first project that we were talking about. Okay, what that does brings me to the second thing I'm going to talk briefly about. And in this case, what we wanted to do is better understand current burning practices of Southeastern fire managers and what they perceive to be some future constraints. And particularly what we're emphasizing are perceptions related to urbanization, land cover change, and climate change. And we did this by implementing an online survey. We had responses from roughly 300 longleaf pine fire managers from across the entire region. And our respondents included folks working both in public lands, commercial forest lands, as well as private landholders. Briefly, why we picked this as our system. Longleaf pine is an iconic ecosystem in the area. In many respects, it's sort of a perfect focal system for the Sikas footprint, which is largely what this was rooted in. They're among the most diverse communities in temperate North America. They have high species richness. They have large numbers of endemic flora and fauna. And yet it's estimated that roughly about 5% of the original extent of longleaf pine remains today. And even of the areas that do have longleaf pine, little of it is actually considered to be in what you might call reference condition, either due to fire exclusion, changes in the native ground cover, or other human impacts. So what we have is a great combination of a rich regional biota coupled with a suite of significant threats. It's an area of great conservation interest. It's been named, or the broader coastal plain has been named, of one of 36 global biodiversity hotspots. And as a result, longleaf pine is a major conservation and management focus here. Last thing I'll note before moving on is something that I think probably all of you guys recognize, which is that management in these types of areas needs to be not only relevant to longleaf systems, which is going to involve a lot of prescribed burning, but it also involves a landscape level perspective because of all of the other types of changes that we're seeing in this neck of the woods. It's also important to note that the changes I've been discussing with respect to climate and potential fire regimes are coming at a time when many areas are undergoing rapid transformations in the region. The Southeast is seeing large human population density increases, rates of land use conversion, extensive urban systems are all projected to increase dramatically in upcoming decades. If you look at the 2 images on the right, these are just examples of that. These are from Bluffton, South Carolina, not too far from where I'm at here in Columbia. And these images are just 25 years apart. And what you're seeing are landscapes that were either forested, maybe in agriculture with scattered woodlots. And we're seeing increasingly large levels of suburban, urban, and exurban development in these types of areas. Add on to that additional stresses from the region's ecological systems associated with habitat fragmentation and even the emergence of domestic and international markets for bioenergy. What we have is a great system for looking at how we can assess the interactive impacts of climate change, landscape change, and management of a system of really high conservation interest. So what we did is we asked longleaf pine fire managers a series of questions related to their current burning practices, their priorities for areas they would like to burn, the main constraints that they face, and also those that they expect to face implementing their burn programs as we look about 50 years into the future. What you see here is just a summary of many of these different responses. And again, if you're interested, just contact me and I can fill you in and talk about the manuscript that we are about to submit that's based on this work. The first one, I think, is something that sort of underlies a lot of this research, and that's if you look at burn frequency, almost 40% of the fire managers reported burning less frequently than they should. And historically, longleaf pine would have burned about every 1 to 5 years. Few fire managers, or many fire managers, I should say, were saying they were not able to maintain that for various reasons. And even those that were burning within that window still said they would like to be burning more often to achieve certain management objectives. When we followed up and said, what are the constraints to that? The responses fell into a couple of different categories. So there were structural and institutional constraints. These would be things like proximity to developed areas, the wild and urban interface, concerns over liability insurance and risk avoidance. So many of these, as a result, relate to the importance of future land use change, which is something I'll come back to in just a minute. There are also a series of constraints that were associated with environmental and resource conditions. So these would include things, especially during the growing season, related to weather, like temperature, air quality, dispersal winds, and transport winds, and drought. And if you sort of piggyback this on the first project that I was talking about, as we start to think about restrictions in burn windows, those are thus likely to remain or maybe even become increasingly problematic in the future, which points towards the importance of climate change. So if you put these two things together, and they're interactive, they're not meant in any way to be separate components, what we're trying to identify is we've got significant interactions between potential land use change, which we know and is problematic now and is likely to get worse, and then the importance of climate change as we look ahead in time.
John, you have 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So our follow-up then was, overall, how do you expect the availability of future suitable burning opportunities to change? What we got were responses from many people saying that about 50% of our respondents expect those opportunities to be reduced over the next 30 years for reasons associated with air quality, urban and suburban growth, risk aversion, public concerns over burning, burn weather, and availability of resources. We asked them about urbanization impacts, and just to sort of trace this out, this is looking at the respondents who said that urbanization effects are not at all going to be a problem. That decreases greatly as we go 10 to 30 years out, and far more managers were suggesting that as much as 60 to 70% of them were saying urbanization and landscape change is going to be a problem that limits their implementation of management. Similar thing for climate change. To what extent do you think future climate change is going to affect your burning decisions? Those who responded a little or not at all decreases. Those who respond significantly increases, but we also see greater amounts of uncertainty as we look forward in time. So to wrap this up then, I want to just connect a few dots. So from this, what we see are prescribed fire is going to continue to be the best management tool for limiting wildfires and for managing fire-dependent ecosystems like longleaf. But opportunities are expected to become fewer and less predictable, especially during the growing season. And longleaf stands fire managers believe that urban growth and climate change are going to be increasingly problematic, increasingly constrain their prescribed burning programs by altering fire weather, air quality issues, and increasing the number of people within the wild and urban interface. So if we put this in this larger context of organizations, this is just one of America's Longleaf Restoration Initiative in 2009, came up with plans to increase longleaf pine extent, to increase the amount of annual burning within these areas. And then they came up with a series of recommended actions, and that involved incentive programs, funding, training, improving prescribed burning, working especially with private landowners to encourage longleaf pine restoration, because of course in the Southeast, a large percentage of our land ownership is in private rather than public hands. So what that brings us up to, and this is my last slide, is then this idea of, given that, how do managers adjust their activities to meet the increasing challenge posed by the things that I've talked about over the last 15 minutes? Can they come up with alternative approaches? Can they burn earlier in the day? Can they shift things seasonally? Can they broaden their burn window so that it's not being constrained by the temperature or relative humidity or other thresholds that I mentioned? But they then also have to think about how that relates to certain management goals. And finally, those adaptations are also going to be constrained not just by temperature, but they're going to be constrained by other factors such as resource availability. So the availability of equipment or money or resources to conduct the burns. And if you have greater year-to-year variability, it's going to likely be harder to maintain a regular schedule of burning these types of areas. And for that matter, if they're willing to burn in warmer conditions, what are the implications for things like health risks for people who are conducting those fires? All right, what that's leading into is ongoing work that I've got with my colleagues. I'll bring a number of them up right now because I've used sort of a royal we throughout a lot of this talk. So this work has not really just been me, it's been in association with folks at Tall Timbers like Kevin Hires, Southeast Cask and NCSU with Adam Trando and Pango, and then other folks who've worked on different components of this. That is all I have. Thank you for your time and for your patience.
Great, thank you so much, John. It was really, really great presentation, really interesting work. I don't think we have any time for questions, but the way that this has been working throughout, that if people want to put questions for you in the chat, we can make sure that you get those and get answered throughout the day. And I apologize, I'm keeping my video off because my internet is a little bit unstable. And hopefully that'll improve throughout the day. Anyway.
Thanks, Molly.
Yeah, we'll go on now. Next is me. And let me just give me a second to share my screen here. All right. Karen or Nada, does that look okay? Everyone see my screen?
That looks good.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'm Molly Hunter, Science Advisor for the Joint Fire Science Program. I'm also a Research Associate Professor in the School of Natural Resources and the Environment at University of Arizona. And I'm giving this talk today on changes to fire regimes in the Northern Sonoran Desert, really on behalf of Mary Lata, who's the fire ecologist for the Tono National Forest in Central Arizona. This is her talk and her slides, but she wasn't able to participate in the Congress this week, but I agreed to give her a presentation for her because I do know something about changing fire regimes in this system. So this is a photo of classic Sonoran Desert, albeit one that has recently burned. And the crux of the change here in the system is just an increase in fire in a system that historically fire was relatively rare. And it's an iconic system, much because of the saguaro cacti that you see here, which is this and other species in the system are, have huge cultural and spiritual significance to indigenous people. Also a system that's known for its endemism and biodiversity, and very significant for all the people that live in these systems and beyond. And lots of people travel to this part of the world to see this really iconic system. But it's also an arid system. So historically it was really fuel limited and fire was relatively rare. So this is, as we said in this part of the session, we're kind of focusing on specific geographies. So this one is really a local case study of the Tono National Forest, which is in Central Arizona. But what they are experiencing, and particularly in the Sonoran Desert ecosystem, is similar to what we're experiencing in other parts of the Sonoran Desert, as well as other arid systems throughout the West. So it's a very diverse forest, 28 different ecosystems across about 3 million acres, going all the way from Sonoran Desert, which is shown in the purple at lower elevations, up into desert grassland, interior chaparral woodlands, ponderosa pine forest, and all the way up into mixed conifer forest. Now, as I said, fire historically was relatively infrequent in the Sonoran Desert, but it wasn't, it's not that it was non-existent. So we do get, infrequently, but we do get periods of abundant precipitation that will fuel the germination and establishment of native annual species. And it's a relatively rare event, but it does occur. So it's thought that, in certain times there perhaps would have been enough fuel. And of course, there's lots of lightning ignitions and it's hot and dry here. So there would have been enough fuel in the right conditions to carry a fire. But we also know that there's lots of species in the system that are not fire adapted. So, lots of cacti, the saguaro, and lots of, and some woody species like the palo verde, which is shown in the upper left there, they have photosynthetic tissue within their stems and trunks, and it's exposed to heat and relatively easily damaged by fire. So they're not fire adapted. But that being said, this system does, it transitions into ecosystems that are fire adapted, like the desert grassland and interior chaparral, and it shares some species with those fire adapted communities. So it's not necessarily that fire always produces bad effects. There are some, even you can find some resilience to fire within this system, especially for those species that are found kind of across those transitions. So for example, here showing jojoba, there's also mesquite, various agaves and whatnot that will resprout after being top killed from fire. So there's some resilience to fire within the system. And also even saguaro, this iconic species, it's not fire adapted, but it can withstand some fire as long as it's pretty low intensity, short duration, and most likely doesn't happen very frequently. So this is showing what we think is likely the typical fire regime of the Sonoran Desert, fire return interval of an average of 250 years. So that's just based on how often we would get those conditions that would allow for fire to spread. And even under those conditions, it's likely, given the adaptations of plants in this community, that fire would have been low intensity and pretty patchy in nature. And if you translate that into the Tano National Forest and the acreage of Sonoran Desert scrub, that translates to about 3,000 acres burning a year. And then she's just showing here kind of the contrast to the ecosystems that's just adjacent, typically to the Sonoran Desert, the semi-desert grassland that is much more, has a much different fire regime and much more fire adapted. Now, this is the current fire regime of the Sonoran Desert ecosystem within the Tano National Forest since 1970. And what you can see there is there's several years that really far exceed that average threshold of about 3,000 acres a year. And in particular, more recently, really starting since 2005, which is the year the Cave Creek Complex fire burned, there's several years where there are several tens of thousands of acres burning in the Sonoran Desert ecosystem. So this really represents a profound shift in the fire regime for this system. And some of that acreage has really just been fueled by a few large wildfires. So this is the 2009 Woodbury fire that burned about 130,000 acres, and just over 50,000 acres of that was in the Sonoran Desert ecosystem, which is shown in the light purple here. The year after that, the 2002 bushfire, almost 200,000 acres, and 87,000 acres of that was in the Sonoran Desert habitat. So really, really large events. And this is showing all of the acreage of Sonoran Desert in the Tano National Forest. It represents about 28% of the forest, or 830,000 acres. And since 1970, 400,000 acres have burned, and some of that represents areas that have burned in multiple fires, 2, 3, and in some cases even 4 fires. So if you look at the whole footprint of area within the Tano that's burned in Sonoran Desert, it represents about 36% of that ecosystem type. And what's showing here is just kind of the remaining unburned portion of the Sonoran Desert. So what's the culprit for this changing fire regime? This is, of course, a similar story to what we're seeing in other deserts, other arid systems throughout the West. It's invasive grasses. And the most prominent one really in this forest is red brome, which is a winter annual, germinates in response to fall and winter precipitation, and then dries out early in the spring, produces a continuous fuel bed that is prone to fire spread really from mid-spring all the way into to July, which is when we typically start getting our summer moisture. And it's a prolific seed producer, so once it establishes, it's really difficult to get rid of. Mediterranean grass is also fairly common and has a similar biology in that it's a winter annual prolific seed producer. And you can see in this photo, this is showing both grasses together, but they're creating this really continuous dry fuel bed that, historically what you would have seen in the system is a lot more bare ground between the shrub and the cacti. And I'll mention here, buffalo grass is not so prominent yet in the Tono National Forest, but it's a lot more common in southern Arizona and northern Mexico. But there's some indication that it's also spreading further north. And this grass is another problem one in the Sonoran Desert, but it's different in that it's a warm season perennial grass, so it greens up in response to summer precipitation. And what's particularly problematic about it is just the amount of biomass that it can produce. Once it's established, it can produce fuel loads that are 5 to 6 times higher than that of the native vegetation. And that results in some pretty impressive flame lengths and intensities. And fires, if they start in these buffalo grass patches, they're hot enough that they can really result in complete mortality of the saguaro and other native species. But also, unlike the annual grasses, there are some treatment regimes that have been relatively effective in knocking it back, including mechanical pulling, or really hand pulling, and also use of herbicides. And of course, those treatments aren't without controversy, but there's several management units in southern Arizona that have been pretty successful in knocking back patches of buffalo grass with some of these treatments. Okay, so this is just showing the departure of precipitation from average conditions in the Tono National Forest, kind of in the months preceding and after some of these big fires, both the Woodbury, the bushfire, and the Telegraph fire, which occurred this past summer. And a couple of patterns to notice, and I'll show you some photos that kind of illustrate this. But so prior to both the bush and the Woodbury fires, you notice a pretty significant winter and spring precipitation, and that had the effect of really fueling that invasive annual grass growth that allowed those fires to spread. And then notice, this in this part of the world, we have this bimodal precipitation pattern where half of our moisture comes in the winter and half in the summer. And that summer precipitation is really critical for a lot of our native plant species. And following both of those fires, we had very, very little summer precipitation. But contrary to that, this last summer, following the Telegraph fire, we had a really, really incredible monsoon season. And so I'll show you in these series of photos kind of what that meant for the fuel load. So this is a photo the day before the Woodbury fire. And you can see this is following a relatively wet winter that fueled the growth of this red brome that is really dominating the understory. You see this really continuous grass fuel bed that is going to carry that fire. This is the day after the fire, and you can see, of course, all the grass has been consumed. There's some scorch on the of the shrubs and the cacti, but some still surviving. But then this is following a very, very dry summer. So you can see even some additional mortality of the shrubs and the cacti. So that combination of the fire following this really, really dry period has had a profound effect, I think, on this system. This is a year later. following another winter, not a particularly wet winter, but certainly enough moisture fell to again allow red brome to germinate and establish. So we were back to a system dominated by that invasive grass. Thanks, Karen. And then this is a year later, but after our summer monsoon season. And again, this is a system that's dominated by a dry grass, but unlike previously, this is actually a native summer annual grass green sprangle top. So that summer monsoon season really shifted the dominance of the species. And what I hope you could see from this is what's particularly challenging is yes, the invasion has fueled this this change in the fire regime, but also the fuel and the vegetation in the system is so dynamic, not only in response to fire, but also in response to the variability in the summer and winter moisture regimes. So that's led Mary and her colleagues to try to develop what they're calling a desert condition class index, because there's nothing that really highlights not only the departure of the desert ecosystem in this region from historical relatively healthy conditions, but also the dynamic nature of the fuels and the vegetation. And this is a system where there aren't really obvious management options for what to do with this invasive grass, but I think it sounds like there's certainly a lot of interest in trying new things. So that includes some of the stuff they're talking about is sort of delineating areas ahead of time for burnout operations so that you can really protect intact Sonoran desert, or maybe even doing really targeted grazing or fuel breaks, or even prescribed fire to break up that continuity of dry fuel. These are all things that I think they're interested in experimenting with, but first really need to have a good handle on and a good mapping tool that shows what the condition of the desert really is and how it changes over time. So they're developing this this index based on the fire history, the time since fire, also both the severity of the fire, both the vegetation severity and the soil-borne severity, as well as a host of other things that we know are really important for the desert ecosystem, like presence of trees and shrubs that act as nurse plants for the establishment of a lot of the saguaro cacti, as well as a lot of other cacti species. So those are some of the things that they are incorporating into this desert condition class index, which I gather they hope to have a draft form sometime this next year, and then open for comment from specialists, scientists, and managers that could result in other things being incorporated into it.
2 minutes.
That's all I have. I'll stop sharing. And it looks like we're just about at time there. And I'm not seeing any questions, which is good, because this is certainly not, at least the desert class condition class index is not something I'm working on. But if there are any questions, be sure to put them in the chat, and I'll either try to answer them, or I will pass them on to Mary and see if she can answer them for you. Okay, with that, I think we'll go on to our next speaker, which is Hugh Safford from the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Southwest Research Station, who's going to be talking about changes that are seen in California. Go ahead, Hugh.
Thanks, Molly. Let me know if did this come up?
Looks great.
Fantastic. And I just want to note, I don't work for the research station. I actually work for the Pacific Southwest region. And I'll just start. This is going to be a pretty different talk. I'm going to be talking about some sort of non-sciencey topics more related to private investment and prioritization tools in pulling off a large landscape management project. A whole bunch of collaborators from a bunch of different groups, and I won't go into them because I don't have time. Thanks. Anyway, this is a little bit of a background slide just to give you a feel where everyone's talking about fire, obviously, in this session. This is the Yuba River watershed, which is actually the last remaining major Sierra Nevada watershed on the west slope without a mega fire in the last 20 years. Completely randomly, I'll be talking about this watershed. And it's a great example of a place that we hope to be able to pull work off rapidly enough to avoid the fate of most of the watersheds north and south of us. So the Yuba River watershed is an important one in the Sierra Nevada. It's about provides about 30% of the water that goes into the Feather River, which is the major provider of water in the California aqueduct system that feeds Southern California. A lot of water is diverted from it for agricultural irrigation as well. One of the most important inhabited fish streams in California. Very high biodiversity landscape. An example of that is it's one of the places with the highest density of spotted owl nesting sites that haven't burned up yet, obviously. And even though the population is largely rural, there's a lot of people. There are a lot of people moving into the landscape, and there's a really strong trend of very heavily, quickly growing recreational use, particularly hiking, fishing, mountain biking. And the watershed sustained a lot of environmental damage in the 19th and early 20th century. In particular, it produced more gold than any other watershed apparently in the U.S. and mostly through hydraulic mining, which beat the hell out of the landscape. It dropped about 20 million cubic meters of mining debris into the streams and into the Central Valley. The landscape's also very flood prone. As a result of that, it's been heavily dammed, and today it's actually one of the world's most complex hydroelectric systems. So this is the project area I'm actually going to be talking about. That's the Yuba watershed. The North Yuba watershed is the northern blue polygon, and the North Yuba Forest Partnership assessment area is within the area circumscribed or bounded on the north rather by the yellow dotted line. And the reason for that is that's the boundary of the Tahoe National Forest. So in terms of the North Yuba itself, a whole series of modern day threats and challenges. A lot of these will be similar to other watersheds that many of you are working with in the US and outside the US. In this case, there's a very heavily checkerboarded ownership. A lot of that's actually owned by large timber management organizations. Heavy mercury loading in mine tailings, reservoir and river sediments as well. Forest growth is very dense, quite homogeneous due to logging and fire suppression, and it's very subject to severe fire. And as I said, it's somewhat of a miracle that we haven't seen a big fire in the landscape yet. And then with respect to economics and work capacity, all of them are on a downward trend. There's a long-term loss of forest-related employment. Local wages are notably lower than state averages. There are no sawmills in the entire watershed or in either Sierra or Yuba counties stretch well beyond the watershed, nor are there any functioning bioenergy plants. And the nearest sawmills are 60 to 80 miles distant, right? Which results in very high transportation costs, and they tend to be filled with private land. Saw logs as well, particularly as everything's burning up, the private landowners are salvage logging. And then finally, with the sort of the beginnings of migrations of urban people into the landscape, we're losing the connection to actually the active forest management, and there's quite a bit of conflict with respect to these divergent views on what really is the best way to go to conservation versus trying to do something about forest conditions. So here's a picture of just a couple of pictures of Downieville to give you an idea of how different the landscape looks today. This is Downieville in the 70s. Downieville is the largest town in the Yuba watershed. And then Downieville on the right, you can see it looks pretty different today. Mind you, the photo on the left certainly incorporated pretty heavy human degradation since the 1850s in it. So I wouldn't use it as a photo depicting natural range variability or anything. But anyway, the landscape has changed a lot. And then again, typical for a lot of the West, there are all sorts of broad-scale climate and fire trends that are threatening forest sustainability. Those include rapidly rising temperatures. They include rapidly decreasing snowpack, and they include obviously California's well-known fire trend recently. So the need for landscape restoration across California is absolutely massive. This is a graphic that was put together by the Sierra Institute in 2018. It doesn't even include the North Fork Partnership because that was just getting rolling at the time, which is testament to how quickly that project has gotten rolling. But I mean, one of the issues with these big landscape restoration projects is they're top heavy, right? And they are cumbersome. And even the very best funded and highest profile efforts have a heck of a time meeting their stated goals. These are just a couple of examples of collaborative forest landscape restoration program projects that were funded in California back in the first round about 10 years ago. And you can see that even with millions and millions of dollars available every year upfront, and a lot of the planning finished already, they're still only accomplishing about half of the acres that they had intended to accomplish. And most of those are actually being done in projects that had the need to be done even before CFL came into existence. So anyway, so large multi-party collaborative. They're obviously essential complex landscapes, places with multiple, but they can be really hard to pull off. And I won't dwell on any of these challenges. I think most of you probably understand them really well. But some of the really important ones, getting the right people in the room. That is, what is the minimum number of people or organizations participating, but such that it represents all of the important issues. There's a need in these kinds of landscapes for huge amounts of funding, but that needs to be available. They need to be available immediately. That need to be dedicated and have to be dependable. You've got the classic issue of aligning diverse organizations goals. How do you prioritize, right? How do you do this in a transparent and collaborative way? And all these other kinds of issues that we run into. So this North Yuba Forest Partnership has tried some different things. It's very similar to other collaboratives in some ways, and it has the familiar partnership goals. I'm not going to go into those, but they tend to be really similar in most watershed level work. But it's kind of a unique partnership. The landscape itself stretches from the foothills up to the Sierra Crest, and it incorporates very local citizens groups that are focused on the one hand on river health and on the other hand on local jobs. There's a major international conservation organization involved, the Regional Water Agency, there's county government, there's a tribal group, the Nisenan tribe is involved in the project. There's a federal land management agency, the Forest Service, along with the National Forest Foundation. But what I'm going to focus on actually are these last two bullets, which is that there's kind of some neat novelty in the project as well that revolve around how it was financed, and it continues to be financed. And then there's a really interesting new prioritization tool that was used to help streamline a lot of the input and a lot of the outputs. So I'll start with the innovative market-based solution to ecological problems. It's called the Forest Resilience Bond. And this is something that was invented by a firm called Blue Forest Conservation. And I've provided a link there at the bottom so you can go do some more reading on this. They have some great video summaries of what a forest resilience bond actually is. But basically, Blue Forest noted that there's an investment gap of hundreds of billions of dollars internationally in environmental conservation. And even though in the United States currently there's quite a bit of money showing up in the agencies and elsewhere to try to do some of this large landscape work, that isn't guaranteed. And heck, all it'll take is a different election result next November, and that stuff could dry up real quick. So the point is that private capital is really important to be able to pull all this stuff off. And in Blue Forest's estimation, really, we just need to figure out what kind of tools are out there. How do we get private investment involved? So the idea is then to bring stakeholders that benefit from the restoration together to share in the cost of reimbursing investors who provide the money to actually do that work. So in the case of the North Yuba Forest Partnership, and I'll show you a little diagram of how this thing works. But in the case of the partnership, the groups that the major investors were the CSAA insurance group, figured that less fire risk on the landscape meant fewer wildfire claims. Many of you know that insurance companies are fleeing California currently because of all the fire damage, fire loss. Calvert Impact Capital, which is engaged in dealing with air and water quality, very interested in creating rural jobs, and then a couple of foundations. And then the paying beneficiaries, or the guarantors of the investment, if you will, are the Yuba Water Agency, who sees increased forest resilience equaling better water quality and therefore, less treatment cost, less debris and sediment in reservoirs to clean out every year, which saves them millions, and less damage. And then CAL FIRE, whose business revolves around obviously fire risk, suppressing costs, stabilize the carbon stock. So this is a diagram from the Blue Forest website. And again, you can go check the website out. This is really cool stuff, in my opinion, anyway. And basically, investors provide the money up front, flows through the Forest Resilience Bond, the implementation, which is happening through National Forest Foundation, who are actually selecting the contractors and monitoring the work. Goes into restoration activities. Those multiple benefits then lead the beneficiaries to drop off the money they guarantee to pay for this stuff plus a fixed rate of return to investors into the forest resilience fund. And in this particular case, CAL FIRE and the Yuba Water Agency agreed to guarantee 4% return to CSAA and Calvert, which is a great return given that Treasury bonds are currently yielding about 2%. And then they agreed to pay about 1%. Anyway, that's the background on the forest resilience fund. So then the other thing I wanted to talk about was the prioritization tool that's called Landfinder. It was developed by a firm called Vibrant Planning. And basically, this firm joins forestry with Silicon Valley computer engineering. The point of the tool is to streamline and democratize. Basically, it's an interactive cloud-based tool that helps to support shared stewardship, and it can be used at any scales because the data set is actually starts with sea-level data, usually LiDAR or some surrogate for LiDAR, and therefore it can be scaled up. So the cool thing is that the tool actually can form an interest, people working sort of at the per acre scale on the ground, like foresters, project implementers, and locals, but it can also be scaled up, assuming data availability, up to larger, broader scale as well. And so, when you think about, I talked about how a lot of these collaboratives are very cumbersome. You've got old-fashioned processes, paper-based processes, inefficient stakeholder engagement, different priorities and perceptions of risk and opportunity. And the nice thing about a tool like Landfinder provides a common platform for looking at the data, for trying different kinds of scenarios and prioritizations, getting a better feeling on the screen as to what collaborators have in common and where they differ as well. And I think the key with the tool is that because it's a prioritization tool, it basically it's generating scenarios that allow participants to focus on actually determining where the most important acres are versus what usually happens in collaboratives, where basically things default to the cheapest acres that can be treated at the lowest cost and done most rapidly. So how does it work? I'm not going to spend any time on this complex diagram, but you got a data collection step, and then there's a landscape assessment organization. And then what I'm going to bring up here is these are where stakeholders input information are involved directly in the process. And so they're involved in IDing strategic assets, resources, and areas. And I'll talk about that again in a second. Stakeholders also weight management priorities on the landscape in a later stage. I'll explain that in a second too. And obviously, stakeholders will always be engaged in the process once the planning document is handed off to the implementing agency. So let's see, I'll go here. So yeah, in terms of stakeholder input one for these SARAs, basically SARAs can be anything, right? That's valued. So it can be infrastructure, tribal cultural sites. It can be endangered species habitat, recreational infrastructure, old growth forests, spotted owl nests. But then what land technical actually does is it allows these socio-ecological values to be normalized, social values with the ecological values. It can calculate risk and the avoided loss as well of all these things under a variety of different scenarios, disturbances, and treatment options as well. That's where a lot of the work is in this. And if you look at the documentation behind this tool, it's like 700 pages long currently. And I would say probably 300 or 400 of them are dealing with evaluations of SARAs. One of the coolest things in this is this restorative return on investment, where the people who developed the tool sat down, and this took a couple of years to pull this off. But basically, they've taken all of the different strategic assets, resources, and areas in the area, and they've determined, what are the values of these things before treatment and after treatment in a relative sense. In this case, it's a variable density thing, but it could be just about anything in the case of a forest or another landscape. And so then on the other side, you get your unplanned disturbance effect. So they can burn a fire and pull through the landscape, for example. Gotcha, thank you. And then, they can figure out a post-disturbance change in value in the context of not having performed a forest management treatment, or in the context of actually having done it. You can combine those two to get what they call a return on investment. The cool thing about this is it then helps you to actually understand which treatment type has the largest ROI, and you can compare these different SARAs across scenarios to get a feeling for where in the project area you're going to get your biggest bang for the buck. And then finally, this second stakeholder input, this goes into actually weighting management priorities. And in the North Yuba Forest Partnership, the management priorities were represented by the 10 pillars of resilience, which was developed by the Tahoe Central Sierra Initiative, which is an even broader landscape initiative. That's watershed improvement program of the state. And I want to acknowledge Pat Manley and Nick Kovac and some other folks who put this together. The pillars are kind of cool. And so the stakeholders in this case actually help to determine what the weightings are for the whole landscape, but this can also be done for sub-project areas. And you get a restorative return on investment for every pillar and every SARA in each project polygon. Again, this is a ton of work that goes into this, but the tool does this very rapidly and actually allows stakeholders to see outputs so they can compare the different priority weightings and make decisions as to where they really want to focus. And then finally, the outputs from this land tender tool go into an optimization model, which in this case was Alan Ager's Forces tool, which provides then a little bit of ideas. So the land tender outputs also include the number of projects for the landscape, what kinds of treatments are going to be done in the different projects, and how they should be best sequenced. It provides cost estimates for all of the projects, and it actually can provide workforce estimates as well. And that's the current module being added to it, so that you can actually start at the back end and get a feeling for what sort of product destinations you need, what sequencing, what the cost is going to be, and what sort of workforce you actually need to pull the work off with. So basically, in the end, I mean, this tool is meant to make stakeholder engagement and prioritization more efficient. It cuts time and it saves money. And in the case of the North Fork project, comparing it to some of the similarly sized collaborative restoration projects going on around North Fork, it cut the time by about half in terms of the planning side and cut costs by about half as well. Anyway, I think that's my last slide. Thanks a lot. I raced through that even more quickly than in my practice. So thanks.
That was great, Hugh. Thank you so much. We do have time for a quick question, and then there is one that we've seen in the chat for you, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
Okay, so it's, how do you navigate the trade-offs that come with trying to attract private investment where the fundamental objective is for profit? Is the hope that it frees up public sector funds to better focus on values and objectives that are important to society but are not captured by market actors?
Yeah, those are great questions. And forgive me, for some reason, I can't get my Zoom to pull up right now, so we can't see who asked them. I'll figure it out in a second. You can hear me, right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think, this is, wow, a lot of people think of this as like, hey, man, this is a deal with the devil. But I mean, really, in the end, public funding tends to be much scarcer than the need for it. It's also very slow. And this is the thing that the Forest Resilience Fund can help deal with, is one, helping to give investors who are interested in green investment and also in a decent rate of return for, ecosystem services or for whatever you want, the ability to actually pull that off. But secondly, it also creates a situation where the money becomes immediately available, and hence the work to start when the planning is finished. I mean, what happens with most federal and state dollars is it's all done on an invoice basis, right? And usually you get about a tenth of what you need. So everything is super slow. It's very cumbersome. You have to actually find upfront money to get the work done. So this solves both of those problems, right? You can find the public investment, and the private investment, and there's way more money available through private investment than government investment for most of these kinds of projects. It's just that it's not showing up because people don't know how to make it happen. But then when the money actually shows up, it's available immediately and people can get to work right away. And I don't see there really being any, anyway, so that's my answer, I guess.
Great. Yeah, and then one more question that came in is, it seems sort of uncanny that the Yuba watershed hasn't
Yeah.
Any other factors that you think might be influencing that?
No, I don't. I think any landscape's going to have some random, watersheds that haven't burned up. Best example I would say is the Sierra National Forest. We used to call it the asbestos forest because it never had big fires, and all of us thought and sat around and generated models while we thought that was, and now it's like the most landscape in California over the last 5 years. So I think basically what we're looking at is just random placement of fires. It's cool and it is uncanny. It is not due to forest treatment yet. A lot of work is happening on that landscape now, but man, are we in a rush to make sure it doesn't become the next landscape.
Great. Yeah, and if we get any other questions, I'll be sure to in the chat, I'll be sure to direct them to you, but really appreciate your really interesting presentation, Hugh, and your really provocative work. But now I think we're going to move on to the next presenters, which is Sarah Trainor from University of Alaska and Jeremy Littell with USGS. We're going to be focusing on their work in Alaska.
All right, thank you, Molly. This is Jeremy Littell. I'm going to start off here and then hand off to Sarah partway through. On behalf of my co-authors who are listed here on the slide and my co-presenter, Sarah Trainor, I want to thank you for listening to our presentation on a collaborative workshop we were fortunate enough to work together on. The goal of that workshop was to review information that might improve wildfire decision-making for the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge, which is in north central Alaska. You can see from the slide here that this is the work of many. Obviously, no one person has all the information needed, and we'll give you a tour of why that's so as we go through our description of the project. But the workshop really grew out of the realization by Refuge Manager Jimmy Fox, whom you might have heard of from yesterday in a panel, and Regional Fire Ecologist Lisa Saperstein, that the existing fire plan for the refuge might be too limited, especially given recent fire changes and expected climate changes in the region. Next slide, please. On the left here, you can see a map of wildfire perimeters in central Alaska from 1980 to, from 1980 to last year. And then the refuge boundary highlighted in the northern central part of the screen there. This story really starts with the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge Fire Management Plan, which was developed in 1980 and modified through time, but didn't really actively prepare for climate change. And now we face 21st century challenges that really defy the status quo in that fire plan. Recent fire years like 2019 redefined for us in the region what normal means. And future climate and lightning projections suggest substantially increased fire hazard and higher summer water deficit and more lightning for the region. So we could reasonably expect more fire in the future. Jimmy noted a dissonance between the resistance to change from the era that plan was developed in and the need to adapt to the likely future and how different it's likely to be. And regional differences, though, in fuels and fire occurrence, severity, and risk mean that there's no single Alaskan approach to adaptation and resilience. So that plan has to factor in a lot of local information as well. We can't just apply what we know from the course scale to the finer resolution of the region. Okay, next slide, please. Here you see some future projections for climate. Yukon Flats is the front lines in many ways. The climate is changing very rapidly here, and the landscape will follow suit, even if it hasn't already. These are just future projections for cold season snowpack, summer temperature, and warm season deficit for the region around Yukon Flats Refuge. And then on the right, future projections of changes in the fire frequency across that landscape based on the climate and fuels that are there now. And also dynamic fuel as you move forward in the future. Anywhere that's orange in those right side maps represents an increase in in frequency of fire relative to the historical under a couple of different climate models. These are for a warmer future, the RCP 8.5 that you might have heard about earlier. But in most cases, warmer models project very large increases in area burned on parts of the refuge and in the region around it. So the projected future climate situation, regionally speaking, is conducive to a very large change in fire activity. Okay, next slide. But the fire information needs are much more complex than just the future climate and the impacts on vegetation. The management mandate for the refuge and for all of the people in the region, really, which includes a lot of other jurisdictions, gets a lot more complicated if you think about the impacts of those fires on managed resources in the region. And those include a whole list of things I've got here on the slide, everything from fuels management, human health impacts, especially on the refuge, fish and wildlife habitat impacts, and the transformation of landscapes that we know historically into different ones in the future, and the resulting implications for not just vegetation, but migratory bird habitat, aquatic habitats, and fisheries. There's a very large whole system set of impacts here. And this is what Jimmy was thinking about in that dissonance that I mentioned earlier. Almost all of these information needs are regionally or locally specific. It's not enough just to apply the general story from the Arctic to this place. And this is true anywhere in Alaska, really. And you can see from the graphic here that the human dimensions of these impacts are quite complicated. And the management has to incorporate that to some degree, hence the need for a workshop that was more diverse than just fire effects. Next slide, please. So really what we're talking about here is a transition from something that looks like knowledge about how the system of fire and climate and vegetation works in the region and how we might manage it. Those are systems and target knowledge, and we've thought that way for a long time. But really, we're moving towards something that looks different and much more complicated. How do we manage the changes in fire regimes and their consequences for all these different endpoints that we're talking about, and for which the Refuge is just one actor in the region? And there's a whole list of questions that we could ask that are much more complicated, but involve the role of people and management in these systems. And so that sets the stage for thinking more deliberately about these in the fire management plan. And now I'm going to turn it over to my co-author, Sarah Trainor.
Thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, I am the director of the Alaska Fire Science Consortium, which is one of the member of the Fire Science Exchange Network. And I'm going to focus now kind of diving in on this specific region and tell you some details about the workshop itself. So we hosted this workshop on the request of the Northern Latitudes Partnership and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And we partnered with those organizations also in organizing, hosting, and are working on writing up a workshop report here. I'm going to tell you now about some features of the workshop that were, I think, really significant. We had a planning and organizing committee, and they worked for over 3 months to put together the participant list, the agenda, really think carefully about how the workshop should be organized and put together. And the participants included scientists as well as managers, and that management group included those from federal and state agencies, as well as managers from local Native organizations and tribes. We also had a graduate student, Abigail Hicks. She gave a poster yesterday that maybe you saw. Her research focused on evaluating this workshop, and she conducted surveys and interviews of workshop participants, and we'll be conducting a second round of interviews now coming up to think about how the workshop may have affected people's thinking and actions over time. We also had a facilitator who was trained in cross-cultural facilitation. This person was also a graduate student and provided a really strong context in planning the workshop and facilitating the workshop and enabling us to track goals and objectives and to frame the discussions. Next slide, please. The workshop itself lasted for 3 days, and we had 4.5 hours each day. It was an entirely virtual online workshop with 16 presenters and 40 participants. There were scientific presentations, but one of the things that Abigail found in her research is that it's really significant that we planned in large chunks of time for discussion. So there was planned discussion after each presentation. At the end of each day was an optional open meeting room that most people stayed on and participated in. And then the entire third day of the workshop was focused on dialogue and discussion. And next slide, please. And by the way, this link in the chat, there's the link here will take you to more information about the workshop with the agenda and also these specific background materials that I'm about to share with you. The content of the workshop itself was focused on this specific location, the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge, and especially on various specific vulnerable landscape features such as Yadama, which is organic, rich, very old Pleistocene age permafrost with an ice content of 50 to 90%. It's a unique feature of this boreal forest and northern ecosystem, but it having that specific focus was a specific element of our workshop. We also provided background materials in these, and including tailored geospatial products, both during the workshop and as background materials. You can find those on this website. And those background materials also ranged from high-level overviews of climate issues to detailed scientific publications. Next slide, please. So just to remind you that there was a large motivation for this workshop, again, was this perceived dissonance in maintaining this sort of inclination to maintain the status quo of management, while a significant recognition that not only is the climate changing, but the fire regime is changing and there are impacts. This slide just shows you an illustration of the temperature warming, over seasonal temperature warming in the Yukon Flats Refuge. And then the next slide, please, shows you the increased frequency of large fire years. The refuge has 8.6 million acres. And in the last 60 years, 64% of this area has been touched by fire. Since 1988, the frequency of years that have burned with over 250,000 acres on the refuge has quadrupled. Next slide, please. And then again, focusing on this specific location, as Jeremy mentioned, there's a broad suite of complex impacts that occur in Alaska. And here on the refuge, this map shows you there are 8 communities that are within the refuge boundaries or very near the perimeter. These, especially the communities within the refuge, are Gwich'in Athabascan communities located the refuge itself are their traditional homelands. With the exception of Central and Circle, which are about 130 or 150 miles from Fairbanks on the road, all of these communities are off the road system and they are accessible only by air or river. And the population sizes range from 4 in Beaver to 561 in Yukon, in Fort Yukon, with a total of roughly 1,000 people. Not only do these people live within the refuge boundaries and rely on the ecosystems as their traditional homelands for food and subsistence activities, but the fire impacts them in multiple ways. Of course, we have ecosystem impacts and smoke impacts. As you can imagine, most of these small communities don't have just health clinics, and many of them do not have buildings. It's rare for there to be a building with a ventilation system where elders or children or other vulnerable people can escape smoke. And also in these communities, if smoke is impeding air travel, then they're not receiving their mail or deliveries for stores. So medical supplies, diapers, toilet paper, other household items cannot be brought into these communities. We also have an added complexity here that roughly half of these communities have type 2 EFF suppression crews. And for some of the people on these crews, their summer income of $3,000 to $4,000 is the only source of cash income that they receive year round. And these crews are also a source of pride and community cohesion for these communities. Next slide, please. Yes. And in addition to the wildfire exposure and impacts on these communities, we also have other multiple compound stressors that involve climate impacts on subsistence food species. This graphic here shows you impacts on salmon. These communities have a very high cost of energy, and also a historical legacy of colonization that impacts many of their social and economic conditions. So next slide, please. So I want to frame the rest of this talk around the questions that Molly Hunter has posed in terms of the talking circle and what we can learn from this workshop. The questions that were posed are really, what are the key science collaborations and partnerships or other enabling conditions that can facilitate the adoption of new management approaches in changing fire regimes? And also, how do we evaluate or measure the success of these approaches? So next slide, please. I'm going to share with you 3 key features or factors that we've identified that from the workshops that help facilitate this dialogue and discussion. And the first is initiative, innovation, and vision among the management of the refuge and the fire managers. As Jeremy mentioned, Jimmy Fox is the manager of the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge. Lisa Saperstein is the regional fire ecologist for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And both of them really brought an innovation and an impetus for holding this workshop and challenging the vision of the status quo. And during the workshop, Kent Slaughter, who is the BLM Alaska Fire Service Director. Now, Kent had some comments that were really pivotal. And in framing this, the Alaska Fire Service is the fire suppression agency for the lands roughly north of the Brooks Range in Alaska. So as director of this suppression agency, he was explicitly open to changing management regimes. And this openness really created a space for dialogue and discussion throughout the workshop. Next slide, please. The second key feature or factor relates to the trusted and longstanding relationships that exist in the region. And these are largely a factor of the boundary organizations that helped host and put together this workshop, the Alaska Climate Adaptation Science Center, and also the other organizations, specifically, for example, the Alaska Fire Science Consortium, which I mentioned is funded by the Joint Fire Science Program and is one of the members of the Fire Science Exchange Network. And we've been working in Alaska for over a decade to provide information to managers, but to also build relationships between managers and scientists, among the managers and also among the scientists. So many of the scientists who participated in this workshop have been previous presenters at AFSC workshops and webinars, and the managers, the fire managers, had existing relationships with these scientists going into the workshop. Next slide, please. So these existing relationships, we believe, really laid the groundwork for having a real grounded discussion in how do we adjust, or is it worthwhile to rethink management structures. And I'd like to share with you an insight that Jeremy shared as we were preparing for this talk, that the science is a catalyst to start the discussion and the foundation for understanding changes, but it's really the managers and people on the ground that give the relevance and application. So having this dialogue between scientists and managers was really key. Next slide, please. The third feature or factor in the workshop that we feel was significant was the real grounding in the place-based focus of the refuge and in the geospatial products that were put together by Zav Gravinsky. This map shows you one of them, to really ground the discussion. The workshop emphasized decision-making and feasibility and what's achievable on this land and this specific place with the information at hand. So the products were custom built for this workshop and tailored to the region. I should note, however, that there isn't this level of detail of data available for all of the refuges in Alaska. So this is a unique opportunity here, perhaps. Several people, in reflecting on the workshop, commented that it was really key to have these detailed maps. And I will give you one small example, or maybe a big example, because people have commented, is this is sort of a key moment in the workshop. As I mentioned, the third day was focused on discussion, and that night after the second day, a really engaged and collaborative permafrost scientist, Tor Jurgensen, sent around a one-page draft suggesting ways to think about managing two different kinds of permafrost. One is this Yedema, this older, deeper permafrost, and the more shallow permafrost. And he suggested trying to reduce fire on top of the Yedema in order to preserve this feature. And that suggestion could have jump-started the discussion on day 3 about what can actually happen in this specific place with the specific features here.
1 minute, Sarah.
Oh, next slide, please. So talking about evaluating success, our experience here is I suggest placing dedicated time and resource on evaluation early in the process, and thinking about that if you're going to engage different stakeholders or different groups in your process, think that there may be different definitions and different metrics of success, and be sure to include those in your evaluation process. So in summary, next slide, please. We found that relationships are key, and boundary organizations can really go a long way in helping to build and maintain those relationships and host workshops such as this, providing logistical support. The place-based focus with geospatial products was really significant in our case. And in terms of evaluation, I think it's worthwhile to dedicate time and resources to the evaluation, as well as considering multiple perceptions of success. Next slide, please. So thank you all. Thank you to the workshop participants. Thank you to Zav Gervinsky for all his work here with us today. And our contact information is there. We are available for discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah and Jeremy. That was really interesting. I was furiously taking notes, and I'm looking forward to digging into a lot of those topics a little bit more in our fire circle that is following our last talk in this session. So with that, I'll move on to introduce Garrett Meigs, who's with the Washington Department of Natural Resources, who's going to focus on the Eastern Cascades. So go ahead, Garrett.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Sound check. Okay, good. My computer's acting a little squirrely, so I'm going to say hi on the camera, and then I'm going to go hide. And
Garrett, if you're speaking, we can't hear you.
okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for sticking with me on this and coming in this Friday. It's been a really great conference. I missed the good old days of in person, but there's a lot of advantages to virtual as well. So assuming you can hear me and see the screen, I'm going to get into this talk here. It's really focused on Washington State and the Cascades, and looking at the combination of drought, fire, and forest loss. And wanted to acknowledge co-authors on this particular project at the DNR, as well as Nature Conservancy and Resilient Forestry. And this work is really possible because we work with a lot of really great partners and collaborative partnerships. So just want to start with a photo of a landscape. This burned in the fall here. This is north central Washington. The Cedar Creek fire is one of many large fires this season. And this one is particularly interesting because it's at this interface where we have forest and non-forest that's really defined by these topographic gradients. So here we have kind of a mosaic of fire effects, which is pretty typical, but it begs the question of which of these areas may not regenerate if it's hot and dry in the future. And so the key points, the takeaway points from the get-go here is that across the East Cascade study region, trailing edge forests, which I'll get into defining in just a moment, are pretty widespread, encompassing about 20% of the forested landscape. These areas span a broad range of settings and landowners, which highlights that these climate adaptation strategies really need an all-hands collaborative approach among partners. And then from 1984 to 2019, hotspots of high severity fire in the trailing edge zone were relatively small, but these locations could be vulnerable to type conversion when they do burn. And finally, the trailing edge forest maps will help decision makers prioritize resources for a number of things, including post-disturbance reforestation, landscape restoration, fire protection, and in the context of this session, climate adaptation. Just a little background on Washington DNR. We have this 20-year plan for forest health, and it's tightly coupled with wildfire protection. And really, it's a climate adaptation strategy. So there's a lot of effort and resources that have gone into developing this program. And one of the benefits of being a scientist on this team is we have a lot of great maps and data to analyze. And just to set context for Eastern Washington, these areas highlighted on the map are priority planning landscapes. So to date, we've got about 2 million hectares analyzed and prioritized for restoration and adaptation strategies. And really the main focus of these areas is fire risk and vulnerability to drought. And that really brings us into this topic of trailing edge forests. So the combined effects of drought, fire, and limited tree regeneration may result in widespread type conversion. And changes from forest to non-forest vegetation could have some serious negative impacts, influencing things like carbon storage, habitats, water and recreation and economies. But in some places we have more trees than we used to. So some transitions are actually consistent with restoration to historical conditions. And there have been high risk forests identified, but we need more information on where these trailing edge forests are located, really what they're composed of, and how much they're actually burning. So the terminology trailing edge and the methods I'm really adapting from work by Sean Parks and others. So I recommend this paper as a reference point. And then the specific objectives of this study are to map trailing edge forests based on climatic water deficit and forest cover, to summarize the composition, structure, and ownership of trailing edge forests, and then to quantify fire extent and severity in trailing edge and non-trailing edge forests, which can really be boiled down to 3 questions. Where are the trailing edge forests? What are trailing edge forests? And how have recent fires affected these trailing edge forests? So our study landscape is the east side of the Washington Cascades, which is shown here in this broad outline. And on this map, I'm just showing recent fire activity within the study area, so in these orange polygons, and then blue polygons fire outside of our study area. And the east side of the Cascades is really defined by steep gradients from high elevation, cold and wet forests down to really dry forests and shrub steppe, woodland and non-forest. And it's these lower elevation forests where you have a big intersection of where people live, recreate, and the wildland urban interface. And then in the middle of this, I'm going to highlight in this focal landscape just a central location where we can zoom in and evaluate some of these maps. Just a quick overview on methods. To define and map the trailing edge forests, we use a moving window approach because the relationships between climate and forest cover vary across space. The lower boundary of our trailing edge zone is based on the 95th percentile of the current climatic water deficit, or CWD, in forested areas based on Landsat imagery. And the upper boundary is based on the future CWD, given a relatively high greenhouse gas emissions. When we talk about current, our reference point is 1981 to 2010, and the future is about 20 years from now, 2041 to 2070. Oops, that jumped to the end, sorry. When we summarize composition, structure, and ownership, we're going to just overlay the trailing edge maps with maps from gradient nearest neighbor imputation and an ownership map that we've compiled for all lands. And then quantifying fire extent and severity, we're going to do a similar overlay within the trailing edge forest of Landsat-based fire maps from 1984 to 2019, with a specific focus on trying to identify hotspots of potential forest loss where the trailing edge forests have intersected with high severity fire. And when we say high severity fire, in this case, we're talking about places where over 75% of tree basal area has died. Just a quick note on the CWD metric. It's a synthetic index of the amount of stress plants face based on potential evapotranspiration and actual evapotranspiration. So there's a lot of different climate and topographic variables that go into this, but it's a very good indicator of moisture stress. And it's very convenient for modeling future projections of climate change. So this image just shows the overall water balance for the trees and plants here. Okay, so jumping into some results here, where are the trailing edge forests? And just to orient you, we've got 4 frames. And on the upper left, we're showing the current forest cover, forest and non-forest within our study region. In the upper right, this is a map of CWD, kind of from cold, moist forest up high down to dry, non-forest vegetation down low. And this is the current condition. Here's our future condition. And then by looking at the relationships between current forest cover and CWD and the future, we can delineate what we call trailing edge and non-trailing edge forests. And it's a little hard to tease out at this scale. So we zoom into that focal landscape, and here you can see a little more closely the patterns of current forest cover. And then, for example, the current CWD, this gradient from green to orange and brown here, the places that are really in the drier side of things are places that are really at that current tree line. And in the future, you can see there's a lot more of the landscape that shows up as relatively higher CWD. And so that's how we define the lower and upper boundaries of this trailing edge zone shown here in magenta. So just to summarize, across the Cascades, we have about 387,000 hectares of this trailing edge forest zone, which is about 20% of the forested landscape. In contrast, the non-trailing edge forests encompass about 1.4 million hectares. And these trailing edge forests generally occur at lower elevations in south-facing slopes. And they're relatively widespread, especially in the southern portions of the study area. So you can see especially down here, which is close to Mount Adams, much more extensive trailing edge condition. In terms of the composition, this just summarizes the relative abundance of different forest types in the trailing edge and non-trailing edge zone. So we see that these forests are predominantly dry, mixed conifer forests with more ponderosa pine than non-trailing edge forests. Shown here is orange, about 25%. But they're certainly not all of the trailing edge forests are dry ponderosa pine. And in terms of structure, trailing edge forests have more open structural conditions, especially compared to the medium and large closed canopy conditions of that non-trailing edge forest. So these trailing edge forests occupy pretty typical warm and dry settings, but also a broader range of biophysical conditions across the region. And the other key piece of composition and sort of what are these trailing edge forests I want to get into today is the ownership and the land use. So trailing edge forests are distributed much more evenly among land ownership types than the non-trailing edge forests, which I highlight here in this percent column. And another way to look at it is just across each land ownership category. So for example, about 35% of the trailing edge forest is in federal land ownership, but about 70% of the non-trailing edge forest is federal. And tribal and state are the next two most abundant owners of trailing edge forest conditions. And private non-industrial and industrial have quite a bit more trailing edge proportion than non-trailing edge. This just underscores that these climate adaptation strategies will require all hands collaboration among all partners. Okay, and then to our third question here, how have recent fires affected trailing edge forests? So recent wildfires covered about 83,000 hectares, or 21% of trailing edge forests, and about 360,000 hectares of the non-trailing edge forest. So fire has been much more extensive in the part of the landscape that is much more extensive, which is the non-trailing edge zone. But there's been quite a bit of fire within this trailing edge zone. And just to break down the proportions a little bit more, all forests experienced quite a lot of high severity fire over this time period. And trailing edge forests actually had a little bit less high severity than non-trailing edge forests, indicated here, about 39% versus about 46%. One other way to look at this is getting a little more specific about the landowner fire severity interactions within the trailing edge zone. And this is one thing that really jumped out to me, is that actually tribal lands had the highest percent of high severity fire within that trailing edge zone, followed by federal, industrial, and state lands. But I also want to point out that this is the relative abundance of severity. There hasn't been as much fire in this part of this region in tribal land, so it's about 5,500 hectares of high severity compared to about 20,000 hectares of federal.
Garrett, you have 5 minutes left.
Okay, perfect. So to zoom back out to our regional map, now we're overlaying all the fire perimeters with the trailing edge, non-trailing edge zone. And actually, one thing that jumped out to me, this large fire that burned near Mount Adams is on the Yakima Nation lands. And so that chunk of landscape right there accounts for most of that 5,000 hectares of high severity fire and tribal land ownership. So in general, trailing edge forests are more extensive in the southern part of our region, and fire has been more extensive in the north. So we have a little bit of a mismatch so far. And most of the trailing edge forests have not yet burned. But to really understand some of these overlaps, we want to zoom in for a local scale impact. So back to our landscape around Cle Elum, Washington. Here we show recent fire occurrence. This is just the perimeters of fires. And then I'm going to kind of flip the landscape view and just focus on the burned areas. And we can see the different conditions within these fire perimeters. So for example, here's a fire that was in relatively dry, non-forested landscape, small fire that was moist forest that's not in the trailing edge zone. And then this fire has a mixture of trailing edge and non-trailing edge. And if we mask out the non-standard placing fire, so only high severity fire is shown, we begin to see some of these hot spots of vulnerability. So what remains, these hot pink areas, are places that burn with high severity within the trailing edge zone. And these could be really high priorities for different types of management and prioritization. So just to summarize here, hotspots of high severity fire have been relatively small and isolated to date, but they do add up to about 32,000 hectares. And these locations that haven't yet burned, when they do, are certainly vulnerable to forest loss and type conversion. So again, back to the Cedar Creek fire in 2021, a nice drone image taken by Derek Churchill showing within the trailing edge zone some relatively large patches of high severity fire. And then just to conclude with some implications for management. In the East Cascades, trailing edge forests are widespread, and these areas are primed for transformation as fire activity continues to increase. And although certain values are vulnerable, social vulnerability and carbon and biomass and habitat, lots of things at risk in these forests if they do convert to non-forest. Some transitions to non-forest vegetation are necessary to foster fire and drought-tolerant landscapes. There's this trade-off here. And collaborative planning and monitoring will be essential for understanding the dynamics moving forward. And these maps of trailing edge forest will help decision makers prioritize resources for post-disturbance reforestation, landscape restoration, wildfire protection, and climate adaptation. And that's what I have here. So if there's a minute or two for questions, happy to take it or just continue the discussion.
Thank you, Garrett, for that really interesting presentation. Really great job. So far, I don't see any. Oh, I do see one question. So it says, it looks like the western edge of your analysis area is the Cascade Crest. I expect trailing edge on the east side of your study area. Can you discuss the trailing edge forest you identified northwest of your study area? What perhaps could be going on there?
I'm not sure exactly, but there is a portion kind of up in the North Cascades that has some trailing edge. It's still technically east of the crest. So our analysis stops at the crest, but some of those mountain valleys tend to have higher deficit. And so really deficit's what's driving it and the relationship between deficit and forest cover. But happy to dig in further. It sounds like somebody who's pretty familiar with the area.
Yeah, and I so encourage you to continue to engage with the chat and the Q&A and Huba. I think if there's further engagement, that's a good place to do it. Do you have a question, Susan? I see you popped up.
I do. Great presentation, Garrett. I'm pretty excited to see this analysis. Two-part question really quickly. One is just, how much of that kind of lower elevation east side trailing edge might have been non-forest before, and have you guys looked at some of the departure analysis to think about if the trailing edge is actually restoring previous grasslands? So maybe I'll stop there and ask that one first.
Yeah, that's something we've been thinking a lot. It's a good question, Susan. We're not, in this analysis, we don't have historical estimates. We certainly could dig in deeper in the landscapes where we have those historical photos. So that's something I'd love to chat about with you. So far,
Great.
basically, we're combining all the data sets we have on hand and seeing how fire has been influencing them. But yeah, there's a lot of sensitivity at that lower tree line and some other factors that influence kind of whether or not there are trees there in terms of land use and other factors. So we do need to disentangle some of those things.
One other question that is near and dear to me is I'm wondering if you guys are ready to do a kind of like patch analysis of high severity patches for all of the large wildfires we've had in Eastern Washington. Do you have that data set already available?
We have a bunch of data sets, of course. As you know, for the 2021 fire season, you know, Cedar Creek, when we were visiting with you, we have finished an assessment of high severity patch size distributions. And so that's really focusing on this fire season. And so I think one of the goals is to extend it back and to look at how these things have changed over time. So that's kind of an unfolding process.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Well, really important work. Thank you for it. So, okay.
You.
Yeah, thank you, Garrett. Thank you for those questions. And thank you to everyone who participated in this session. Really, really great presentations and lots of food for thought. And again, I just want to put a plug in for participating in our fire circle, which begins immediately after the break. And that's a chance to really further the dialogue. And we really, as the Joint Fire Science Program, Climate Adaptation Science Centers, and USGS, we all really hope to hear more from you about science needs, partnership needs, and collaborative needs. So stay tuned. With that, I'll kick it back over to our producer for some announcements.
Thank you so much, Molly. And thank you to all our presenters tonight. Really great job. I just wanted to let you know that if you wanted to access the fire circle that Molly was just talking about, to use the agenda tab and click on sessions, and you'll find everything you need there. And then we also have sessions offered in Spanish and Portuguese interpretation so be sure to select a session titled Fire Behavior. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.